No one inside the palace expected this. Not the advisors, not the courtiers, not even the family members who believed they understood how royal succession truly worked. In a move that stunned the establishment and sent shockwaves through royal corridors, King Charles made a decision so unprecedented it fractured centuries of tradition overnight. A name was spoken behind closed doors, one that was never supposed to be considered, let alone chosen. And once it was said, there was no going back. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The meeting itself was deliberately small, intentionally quiet, and wrapped in a level of secrecy rarely seen even within palace walls. No formal agenda was circulated. No written records were kept. Those summoned understood immediately that this was not routine. King Charles entered the room with a composure that unsettled even his most seasoned advisors, not because he appeared uncertain, but because he did not. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word had already been rehearsed in solitude. When he finally revealed his decision, the air shifted. Silence followed, not respectful silence, but shock. Senior aides exchanged glances, some frozen in disbelief, others visibly rattled by what they had just heard. This was not a minor adjustment or a symbolic gesture. This was a direct challenge to expectations that had shaped royal thinking for generations. Whispers began almost instantly, restrained but frantic, threading through the palace like an electric current. The unspoken question was the same on every face: how could this be happening? The answer lay not in a sudden impulse, but in a realization that had been forming quietly, persistently, for years. This decision did not emerge from chaos, it emerged from calculation. When Catherine's name entered the succession conversation, it landed with weight, not because she lacked respect, but because she represented something the institution had never openly prepared for. Her presence in that room, even in absence, felt disruptive. Advisors struggled to mask their reactions, knowing that any visible resistance could be remembered later. The choice was deliberately kept from the public, because its impact would be immediate and irreversible. Once exposed, it would ignite debate, fracture loyalties, and force the monarchy into a reckoning it could no longer delay. There were signs, subtle and easily dismissed at the time. Changes in who was consulted, shifts in influence, private conversations that lingered longer than necessary. King Charles had been watching, measuring not ambition but resilience, not popularity but endurance. While others faltered under pressure or disappeared into controversy, Catherine remained steady, absorbing strain without spectacle. What looked like silence was discipline. What looked like patience was preparation. This was not a betrayal executed in haste. It was a conclusion reached after years of quiet observation, shaped by fear of collapse and hope for continuity. And as the weight of that choice settled over the palace, one truth became impossible to ignore: the monarchy had already crossed a line it could never uncross. But to understand why King Charles would risk everything on such a move, we must go back to the silent pressures that shaped his reign long before this moment. King Charles has lived his entire life under the shadow of royal mistakes, failed reigns, fractured families, and crowns weakened by internal wars. What few realized is that his greatest fear was never public backlash. It was legacy collapse. In private moments, Charles reportedly questioned whether the monarchy could survive another generation of emotional chaos, and slowly, painfully, he began to believe that the traditional line of succession might be the very thing that could destroy it. That fear did not arrive suddenly. It grew quietly, year after year, shaped by memory and regret. Charles had watched history repeat itself too many times, crowns passed down with confidence only to unravel under pressure. He remembered how authority without emotional control bred resentment, how silence turned into rebellion, and how unchecked entitlement fractured families beyond repair. The idea that he might one day be remembered not as a steward of continuity, but as the monarch who allowed the institution to weaken on his watch, haunted him far more than criticism ever could. In moments away from ceremony and public duty, Charles reportedly revisited the stories no royal ever escapes, reigns that collapsed not because of enemies, but because of internal rot, successions that looked flawless on paper, yet failed in reality. He questioned whether bloodline alone still guaranteed stability, or whether it had become a liability in a world no longer willing to excuse emotional recklessness. The crown, he knew, could not survive on symbolism alone. It needed trust. And trust, once broken, rarely returns. As public confidence in institutions across the world grew fragile, Charles became increasingly sensitive to how the monarchy was perceived beyond palace walls. He understood that the public no longer measured strength through tradition alone, but through composure, restraint, and moral clarity. Advisors quietly echoed those concerns, warning him of quiet fractures forming within the family, tensions not yet visible, but dangerously close to the surface. They spoke of unresolved rivalries, unspoken resentments, and expectations hardened into entitlement. This forced Charles into a conflict he had avoided his entire life. Duty told him to preserve tradition at all costs. Survival told him tradition might be the very thing putting the crown at risk. The more he listened, the more he observed, the harder it became to ignore the truth forming in his mind. Stability did not come from who was next in line. It came from who could endure pressure without collapsing under it, who could absorb criticism without retaliating, who could carry the weight without demanding recognition for it. That realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Terrifying because it meant challenging centuries of precedent, clarifying because, for the first time, Charles felt he could see a path forward that did not end in chaos. His anxiety was no longer about making the wrong choice. It was about making no choice at all and allowing history to repeat itself one final, irreversible time. And as Charles searched for stability, his eyes began to settle on one figure who never seemed to crack under pressure. She was never meant to be the solution. Catherine was supposed to play her role gracefully, quietly, and without disruption. But while others stumbled, she endured. While others reacted, she calculated. Behind her calm smile, palace insiders began to notice something unsettlingly powerful, an ability to steady chaos without demanding control. Over time, King Charles began asking himself a forbidden question. What if the monarchy's future didn't need another king, but something entirely different? Catherine's strength was never loud, and that was precisely why it went underestimated for so long. During moments when the family seemed closest to implosion, when tension thickened the air and tempers flared behind polite smiles, she remained composed. Not detached, not cold, but disciplined. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed pressure without deflecting it onto others. In a household where emotion often spilled into spectacle, her restraint became an anchor. Staff noticed it first. Advisors followed. And eventually, King Charles could no longer ignore it. Behind closed doors, Catherine carried herself with a quiet authority that required no announcement. She asked careful questions. She remembered names, histories, sensitivities. Decisions around her seemed to settle rather than escalate. Where others pushed for dominance, she practiced control through patience. It was not charisma that drew respect, it was reliability. Senior staff began to trust her instincts, not because she demanded influence, but because she never misused it. In an institution built on hierarchy, her power felt paradoxical, real, yet invisible. Charles watched this with growing fascination. He observed how public perception softened around her, how criticism rarely stuck, how moments that might have damaged others simply passed over her without leaving scars. She understood tradition, but she did not hide behind it. She respected it, shaped it, and quietly modernized it without ever appearing to challenge it outright. That balance between continuity and evolution was something Charles had struggled to achieve his entire life. What made Catherine different was not ambition, but restraint. In a family where ambition had caused fractures, her lack of visible hunger for power became her greatest strength. She did not compete. She did not posture. She waited. And in waiting, she outlasted. While outspoken figures burned brightly and then faltered, Catherine remained consistent, unshaken, present. The more Charles compared outcomes rather than intentions, the clearer the pattern became. This realization was deeply unsettling. It challenged every assumption Charles had inherited about leadership. The crown had always passed to those prepared to seize it. Catherine, however, appeared prepared to carry it without ever reaching for it. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. In her silence, Charles saw endurance. In her composure, he saw survival. And in her ability to command respect without force, he saw a future the monarchy had never dared to imagine. But elevating Catherine was not just controversial, it was explosive, especially for those who believed the crown was already promised to them. There are moments in royal life when silence becomes betrayal, when expectation turns into entitlement, and when reality arrives unannounced. For one heir, the realization came not through an official announcement, but through whispers, sudden distance, and doors that quietly stopped opening. Something had changed, and deep down, he knew it wasn't temporary. The crown he had spent his life preparing for was no longer guaranteed. At first, the signs were small enough to dismiss. Meetings that once included him now proceeded without notice. Conversations paused when he entered a room, then resumed with forced politeness. Advisors who once spoke freely began choosing their words carefully, as if every sentence carried risk. Questions were met with reassurance instead of answers, comfort instead of clarity. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The machinery of certainty that had surrounded his future for decades was slowing, then quietly rerouting around him. The silence was the most unsettling part. No confrontation, no explanation, just absence. When he pressed for clarity, responses arrived wrapped in vague language about timing, sensitivity, and patience. He was told not to worry, that everything was as it had always been. But nothing felt the same. The certainty he had relied on was dissolving, replaced by a growing sense that decisions were being made elsewhere, without him, and perhaps against him. Behind palace walls, restraint masked disbelief. Private exchanges were tense, controlled, almost rehearsed. He searched faces for reassurance and found only caution. The realization cut deeply. Loyalty did not equal immunity. Preparation did not guarantee protection. Years of discipline, expectation, and sacrifice suddenly felt fragile, as though they could be erased by a single decision spoken in a room he was never invited into. The emotional fallout was contained, but it was not quiet. Doubt crept in where confidence once lived. Every memory of preparation now carried an edge. Had it all been for nothing? The psychological toll was relentless. A future once assumed now hovered just out of reach, uncertain and conditional. The pressure to remain composed only intensified the strain. To react would be dangerous. To remain silent felt unbearable. So resentment did what it does best in royal families. It retreated inward and grew sharper. What made the situation more volatile was the lack of open conflict. No accusations were voiced. No lines were crossed publicly. Everything remained polite, civil, and devastatingly restrained. But beneath that calm, something hardened. Trust began to erode. Loyalty began to feel transactional. The heir understood now that the crown was not simply inherited, it was chosen. And choice meant comparison, it meant judgment, and it meant the terrifying possibility that he had been weighed and found wanting. This was not rejection in the open, it was exclusion by design. And that made it far more dangerous, because without confrontation, there could be no resolution. Only calculation, only waiting, only the slow realization that power was shifting in ways no one was willing to name aloud. What followed was not anger unleashed, but strategy formed in silence. Yet the most explosive reaction wasn't outrage, it was the silent war that followed. Once word began to spread, the palace ceased to be a unified institution. It became a battlefield of loyalties, whispers, and carefully chosen alliances. Some saw Catherine as salvation. Others viewed her as a threat to the natural order. Meetings grew colder, glances sharper. And suddenly every gesture carried meaning. This wasn't just about succession anymore, it was about who controlled the future narrative of the monarchy itself. What followed was not open rebellion, but something far more dangerous: division wrapped in civility. Staff who had worked side by side for years began to align themselves quietly, testing conversations before committing to them. One careless sentence could determine whether doors stayed open or closed permanently. Advisors recalibrated their proximity to power, not knowing where it would land, but certain it was moving. Loyalty became conditional. Silence became currency. Within palace walls, sentiments began to leak, not official statements, but carefully planted murmurs. A phrase overheard here. A concern quietly shared there. Each leak carried intent, designed to test reactions without exposing the source. Some framed Catherine as continuity disguised as change, a stabilizing force in a fragile moment. Others warned she represented a dangerous precedent, one that could unravel centuries of order with a single decision. Tradition, once revered, was suddenly weaponized, invoked not as principle but as defense. Fear intensified as the possibility of public exposure loomed closer. If this plan surfaced prematurely, it would not simply spark debate, it would detonate. Advisors understood that the public would not see nuance, only rupture. The risk was not just scandal, but loss of control over the story itself. And control, once surrendered, could never be reclaimed. Every move now had to be measured not just internally, but against how it might be interpreted beyond palace gates. Catherine, meanwhile, became the silent center of this growing storm. Her name was spoken more often in private than in public, discussed endlessly without her presence. She was dissected, defended, doubted and reimagined by people who believed they understood power better than she did. Yet she made no visible attempt to intervene. That restraint unsettled everyone. In a culture accustomed to visible ambition, her stillness felt strategic, almost unsettling in its confidence. The palace, once defined by hierarchy, now operated on uncertainty. Old alliances no longer guaranteed influence. New ones formed quietly, based less on trust than on shared fear. Every tradition cited, every rule referenced, carried subtext. This was not a debate about legality. It was a struggle for legitimacy. And legitimacy, once questioned, infects everything it touches. What made the situation unbearable was that no one could openly acknowledge what was happening. To speak plainly would be to admit the monarchy was fracturing from within. So the arguments continued in coded language, behind polite smiles and formal exchanges. The institution projected calm while internally bracing for rupture. And at the center of it all stood Catherine, absorbing pressure without responding, allowing others to reveal themselves through their resistance. The palace was no longer arguing about the crown. It was arguing about identity, about whether survival meant adaptation or obedience to tradition at any cost. And as those debates sharpened, it became clear that the consequences would not be confined to policy or protocol. They would be deeply personal, especially for the woman everyone was talking about, yet no one was truly listening to. But while the palace argued, Catherine herself was facing a far more personal reckoning. The crown is not a gift, it is a burden wrapped in expectation. And when Catherine finally understood what King Charles intended, the weight was suffocating. Accepting meant rewriting royal history. Refusing meant destabilizing a monarchy already on edge. In private moments, She reportedly wrestled with guilt, fear, and a haunting question. Was she protecting the monarchy or tearing her family apart to save it? Her first reaction was disbelief, sharp and disorienting. Not because she had never considered the possibility of greater responsibility, but because this responsibility arrived without warning and without consent. Catherine had built her strength on preparation and restraint, not on surprise. To be chosen silently, without ceremony, felt less like elevation and more like isolation. Emotional resistance followed quickly, a quiet pushback against a future she had never openly sought. She questioned the wisdom of it, the timing of it, and the cost of it, especially to those closest to her. The fear of backlash pressed in from every direction. Catherine understood the public better than most, not because she courted approval, but because she respected perception. She knew how quickly admiration could turn to suspicion, how easily narratives could be weaponized. More than that, she feared the fracture within her own family. Acceptance would not just alter protocol, it would redraw emotional lines that might never be repaired. Every bond would be tested, every silence reinterpreted. In private conversations, she questioned her role repeatedly, searching for certainty and finding only responsibility. There were no rehearsed answers, no prepared guidance. The loneliness of being silently chosen became overwhelming. She could not seek counsel openly. She could not express doubt without it being mistaken for weakness. To the world, she was expected to remain unchanged, calm, composed, reassuring even as everything beneath her shifted irreversibly. Pressure mounted in the smallest details. A pause before speaking. A glance held too long. A decision weighed twice before being voiced. Catherine felt the expectation to absorb change without reflecting it outward, to carry the future without letting it show. That restraint, once her strength, now became a source of strain. The more she maintained composure, the less anyone realized how deeply conflicted she was. Clarity arrived slowly, and without relief. Catherine began to understand that refusal carried its own dangers. Declining the role would not restore balance, it would create vacuum. It would confirm doubts, embolden opposition, and fracture an institution already braced for impact. Acceptance, however painful, offered containment. It offered continuity. It offered the possibility of guiding change rather than being consumed by it. That realization did not erase fear, but it reframed it. The question shifted from whether she wanted this burden to whether she could afford to set it down. Catherine understood then that survival sometimes demands sacrifice without recognition. That leadership, at its most brutal, requires choosing the path that hurts quietly rather than the one that explodes publicly. And just as Catherine reached clarity, the outside world began sensing that something was terribly different. To the public, nothing had been announced. But something felt off. Protocols subtly shifted. Seating arrangements changed. Catherine's presence grew heavier, more deliberate. And royal watchers began connecting dots that were never meant to align. These weren't coincidences, they were signals. And once noticed, they became impossible to ignore. It began with details so small, they could be dismissed as oversight. A step closer to the center. A pause before another spoke. A subtle rearrangement that placed Catherine not beside, but ahead. Those who understood royal rhythm felt it immediately. The choreography was changing. Protocol, that ancient language of power, was speaking without words. And Catherine was suddenly written into sentences she had never occupied before. Ceremonial positioning told its own story. Where tradition once dictated rigid order, flexibility appeared, always tilting in one direction. Catherine's role seemed expanded without explanation, her visibility increased without announcement. She did not seek attention, yet attention found her. Silence followed her movements, not because she demanded it, but because people seemed unsure how to behave around her now. That uncertainty was the loudest signal of all. Palace communications shifted too. Language grew careful, almost coded. Statements referenced continuity, stability, and long-term vision with unusual frequency. Catherine's name appeared more often, paired with words that suggested responsibility rather than support. The tone was subtle but deliberate. It was no longer about presence, it was about weight, and weight, once assigned, is rarely removed. What made the situation eerie was the balance between visibility and restraint. Catherine appeared more often, yet said less. Her silence felt strategic, not evasive. Royal commentators began to sense it, voicing cautious observations without committing to conclusions. They spoke of rebalancing and quiet elevation, careful not to cross lines that could not be uncrossed. But the implication lingered, hanging in the air like unfinished business. Online, speculation accelerated. Patterns were dissected. Comparisons drawn. Past moments re-examined under a harsher lens. What once seemed routine now felt intentional. The internet did what it always does, it connected fragments into narratives faster than institutions could control. Each new appearance fueled discussion. Each omission sparked suspicion. The more the palace remained silent, the louder the interpretation became. And yet, there was no denial, no clarification, no attempt to reset expectations. That absence spoke volumes. In royal history, silence often precedes revelation. Those watching closely knew this. They had seen it before, though never quite like this. The difference now was scale. This was not about a single announcement waiting to be made. It was about a structure slowly shifting under the public's feet. What unsettled observers most was how natural it all appeared. No resistance. No visible struggle. Catherine moved through this evolving landscape with the same composure she always had, as if the weight she carried had simply grown heavier without changing her stride. That calm made the speculation feel more credible, not less. If this were accidental, it would have shown. If it were chaos, it would have leaked. Instead, everything felt controlled. The realization dawned quietly but unmistakably. The monarchy was preparing the public without telling them it was doing so. And preparation suggested inevitability. Whatever was coming would not arrive suddenly. It would arrive after everyone had already felt it. Behind the scenes, King Charles knew the moment of exposure was approaching, and he was preparing for impact. There are decisions a monarch can take back. This was not one of them. On a night marked by tension and absolute finality, King Charles formalized what had once been unthinkable. No press, no ceremony, just signatures, witnesses, and a future sealed in silence. By dawn, the monarchy had already changed, whether the world knew it yet or not. The confirmation did not arrive with drama, but with gravity. It unfolded behind closed doors, in a setting stripped of symbolism precisely because symbolism could be misread. This was not performance. It was permanence. Documents were reviewed with painstaking care, language weighed for consequences that could echo for generations. Each step was deliberate, designed to leave no ambiguity once the line was crossed. Advisors present understood immediately that this was the point of no return. Whatever doubts had lingered were now irrelevant. The machinery of the monarchy had been set in motion, and it would not stop for second thoughts. Legal and ceremonial steps were taken discreetly, threaded through existing frameworks to avoid detection. Nothing flashy, nothing that would raise alarms too soon. Tradition was not discarded, it was repurposed, bent quietly to accommodate a future few had dared to imagine. This careful execution was not about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was about control. Control of timing, control of narrative, control of fallout. The emotional cost, however, could not be controlled. Within the family, reactions were contained but profound. Silence fell heavier than anger ever could. Some absorbed the news with resignation, others with disbelief they refused to voice. Bonds strained under the weight of what was left unsaid. Loyalty collided with hurt. Acceptance clashed with resentment. And through it all, The realization settled in that nothing would ever return to the way it had been before that night. King Charles accepted the consequences with a calm that unsettled even his closest confidants. This was not detachment, it was resolve. He had made peace with being misunderstood, even vilified, if it meant securing what he believed was survival. The crown had demanded a sacrifice, and he had offered certainty in return. Regret would serve no purpose now. History, he knew, would judge later. For Catherine, the moment was quietly devastating. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement beyond necessity. Just the knowledge that a line had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. She stepped into a role she could never escape, not because she claimed it, but because it claimed her. The future closed in, heavy and unavoidable. Whatever freedom she once had dissolved into responsibility. Whatever doubts remained would have to coexist with duty. As dawn approached, nothing outward appeared different. The palace woke as it always had. Schedules continued. Protocol held. But beneath that surface, the foundation had shifted. A decision had been locked into place, and its consequences were already unfolding in ways no one could fully predict. The calm was deceptive. It was the stillness that follows a seismic change before the aftershocks arrive. Because the monarchy does not transform quietly forever. Secrets, especially ones this consequential, have a way of surfacing. And when they do, they rarely emerge gently. But the greatest shock was still to come, because secrets never stay buried in the royal family. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, and exile, but it has never faced this kind of internal reinvention. By choosing Catherine, King Charles didn't just shock the palace. He rewrote the rules of power, loyalty, and legacy. The question now isn't whether the monarchy will change. It's whether it can survive the consequences of choosing a successor who was never meant to rule, but might be exactly what it needs. This decision sends ripples far beyond a single reign. It alters the trajectory of the royal line itself, challenging assumptions that once felt immovable. Succession is no longer a certainty defined by birth alone. It becomes a statement about endurance, responsibility, and restraint. That shift carries long-term implications no one can fully calculate. Traditions built to provide clarity now face reinterpretation, and with reinterpretation comes instability. Some fractures will heal with time, others may harden, becoming permanent reminders of a moment when certainty cracked. Within the family, the emotional toll lingers. Relationships recalibrate under the weight of altered expectations. Trust, once assumed, must be renegotiated. There are wounds that politeness cannot close, silences that will never be filled. The cost of survival is rarely evenly distributed, and this choice ensures that some will carry that burden longer than others. The monarchy moves forward, but it does not move forward unscarred. Catherine's role evolves from presence to symbol. She becomes more than an individual, she becomes an idea of continuity without chaos, of authority without spectacle. That symbolism is powerful and dangerous in equal measure. It invites devotion from those craving stability and resistance from those threatened by change. Her composure, once admired quietly, now becomes a focal point for interpretation. Every action, every restraint, every silence will be examined for meaning. The public reaction is inevitable and unpredictable. Some will see renewal, a monarchy finally responding to the realities of a changing world. Others will see betrayal, a break from the order that once defined legitimacy. Debate will sharpen, allegiances will form. The narrative will no longer belong solely to the palace. It will be contested, reshaped, and amplified far beyond its walls. Backlash and support will coexist, feeding off one another, accelerating the transformation already underway. The risk is profound. Renewal promises relevance but threatens cohesion. Resistance promises loyalty but risks stagnation. The monarchy now stands at the edge of transformation, balancing between adaptation and fracture. There is no safe path, only necessary ones. And history will not judge the intent, only the outcome. What remains undeniable is that the crown has crossed a threshold. The past can no longer dictate the future without question. Power has been redefined, not seized. Legacy has been reconsidered, not inherited. The institution moves forward into uncertainty armed with resolve rather than tradition alone. Whether that resolve sustains it or tests it beyond endurance is a story still unfolding. Because once the crown breaks tradition, it can never return to what it was, and the world is about to find out what replaces it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.